I'm curious if you think that therapy is actually harmful to a degree in this sense.
I love therapy, but there's a part of me that's jaded. I know many people who are in therapy and struggling still.
Yeah.
And they're not feeling any true change. Someone who has depression doesn't need to be a depressed person. A lot of people will attach themselves to the label, and the label actually enables their dysfunctional patterning within themselves and within their relationships.
So what's toxic femininity?
The hyperachieving woman who shames her man. Like the shame and highlighting of the behavior that they don't want. I've seen so many women do this, like say things that if their guy said, they would make the biggest deal over. Oftentimes, women who are very nurturing become the nurturer so often that the man doesn't think to do those little things for her. So it's doing the little things, taking her out to dinner, really taking care of her, including in the bedroom. Like, women should be getting off just as much as men. That shouldn't be something that women have to ask for.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Conversation with Kaizen that I'm super excited for because I have my dear friend, Gina Nappi. Now, Gina is a mindset and manifestation coach, and she's also a highly intuitive person. So intuitive, in fact, that she answered a question that I've been struggling with for days in mere minutes. And you're going to get to experience that from her as well. But titles aside, this is what Gina represents to me. Gina is an incredibly wise human being, and she has a wisdom that is very safe to be around because it is honest and authentic without being abrasive. And she has this ability to engage in really sensitive topics with sensitivity and with grace. And we're going to talk today about mental health, the education system, and how to just live powerfully and with responsibility while also being empathetic to yourself and those around you. And I'm looking forward to you guys benefiting as much from this conversation as I have from my relationship with Gina. So without further ado, Gina, welcome to the podcast.
Kaizen, thank you so much for having me.
I
feel so happy to be here.
Cool. That makes two of us.
Yeah.
Cool. So Gina, there's so many different things we can talk about. And I actually want to start with identity, depression, and anxiety. I think we have a shared history around depression and anxiety, and we'll go into your history. So first, I'm just curious what your mental health journey has been like up to this point in your life.
Yeah, we definitely do have similarities. I've heard your story, and my most notable start was probably around 11 when I realized that I was struggling with suicidal ideation, but didn't know what that meant. There was no term for it at the time. I just knew that I was curious about ending my life and wondering if that was the way to end the pain that I was experiencing that I didn't really know how to process because I was 11. And, at that point in my life, I was struggling at home. My parents were going through a divorce. I was struggling in school with social anxiety and had a pattern of isolation and kind of holding it all in. And so this developed into major depressive disorder and anxiety that actually went untreated for about a decade, other than therapy, which I went to therapy and talked about what I was experiencing. It was an incredible outlet for me to put language to what I was feeling. So at the very least, I could understand my emotions and why I was feeling certain ways. And then when I was 22, I got to a point where it just felt beyond my ability to have agency within it. I felt like a victim to my mind, but it also felt like this separate part of me that wasn't really me. But I didn't know how to gain influence over it and lead it. Felt like it was leading me. And so after a ton of resistance, because I've always been resistant and hesitant with medication, even with Advil. I never even took Advil as a kid very often, unless I really had to. So when I was 22, I was diagnosed by a psychiatrist, prescribed medication that actually made me worse. So I ended up in inpatient a couple of months later, in the hospital for a few days, and then was put on the proper dose of medication. And for the first time in my life, since pre-11, since I was a kid, I felt what it felt like to not feel anxiety. And I just remember thinking like, this is what people live like? Like, this is life for people. This is crazy. And it started a fire in me to create that sense of peace internally, holistically. And so I was on medication for another year and a half, transitioned off. There were definitely some bumps in the road and kind of relapsing with depressive loops and anxiety. But now I've been living symptom free for about 4 years now. And joy is my baseline, which if you told me that at age 14, I just never would have even knew what that meant and what that could feel like. So my mental health journey is something that I'm really passionate about. It's definitely shaped a lot of my empathy and understanding of emotion too, which helps me now in my intuitive business and being able to understand the spectrum of emotions with clients too.
Okay.
Just be able to relate.
Yeah. So I'm definitely seeing the similarities. Yeah. Everything from the social anxiety in high school to keeping it all in to being diagnosed, being told by a psychiatrist, hey, try this. So I'm seeing the parallels here. One thing that you said is you recognized like it was a part of you.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because we're in this kind of weird space, I think, as a society where there's more awareness of mental health and emotional health disorders than ever. But there's also this strong identification with issues and victimhood and all that seems to just be getting in the way of actual progress. So looking back at where you were, obviously you went through a legitimately difficult time and had suicidal ideation. I was in a similar place. But how do you think that people should be relating to their patterns versus how people are relating in society?
Oh my gosh, love this topic. And I think that there's this identification, especially with a diagnosis from a medical professional, like you have this, it can feel like diabetes, like something that you have and that you in some ways have no control over. But someone who has depression doesn't need to be a depressed person. And I think a lot of people will attach themselves to the label, and the label actually enables their dysfunctional patterning within themselves and within their relationships. And there is nothing worse than interacting with friends, feeling my anxiety take the wheel or feeling my depression take the wheel and not being a good friend and feeling like my depression was the reason for that. And so I have a pet peeve with when people say, oh, that's just, my depression. I was having a depressive episode. Really sorry. Like, it's almost like we're giving the label of the mental disorder agency over our actions and justification for dysfunctional patterns that we actually have to own, even when they're dark and we're ashamed of them, in order to rewrite them and change and identify with a version of ourselves that is better at relating, which will lead to more joy. So yes, I see a lot of people kind of labeling and getting stuck in the identity. And I wish that more people had guidance in, yes, you're experiencing this, and here's how you rewrite those patterns in your identity to associate with a healthy version of self, which we have full control over.
I love that. And that's a really great point because it's so easy to identify with a pattern and make it who you are rather than something you're experiencing. And
yes,
this still sticks in my mind. It's actually so curious that there was this guy who followed me on Twitter years ago when I used to commentate and for video games and had attracted all sorts of interesting types. And there was this guy who he seemed great. He was in a troll or anything, but his name, I'm not going to say his actual Twitter name, but imagine combining the word depression with your first name. So like imagine naming yourself Depressed John. And that's how he identified himself to the world. So it's like not only, I'm sure he was actually experiencing depression, but not only was he experiencing depression, he would lead with that when he was interacting with people. So what do you think it is about the psyche that leads people to even seem to want to identify with whatever dysfunction or disorder that they're experiencing?
Yeah. Oh, I have mixed feelings about that. I'm so like, man, I think it's when we feel shame about our behavior and it's easier to blame the label and this thing that says we're imperfect, we're broken, and to associate our broken behaviors with that label, to almost like relocate responsibility so that we don't have to hold it. And I think people want to feel comfortable, people want to feel safe. And sometimes the best they can do is just finding, what's the word I'm looking for?
Solace.
Yeah, like finding solace in an identity, because that's the best that they can do. And I also think it's very self-centered. It's like looking at the lens through only your experience versus like, yeah, I'm experiencing depression, and maybe the situations in my life that have triggered this depression in me and altered my thinking to be disordered thinking, maybe this is my path to learn how to overcome, so that way I can serve others with my experience, like not just bringing myself to a place of joy, but being able to help other people who are in a state of hopelessness or in a state of stuckness, and making positive difference in the world versus being validated and special for having this label that in some ways has become like a fad. Like it's almost normalized to have anxiety and depression, and it doesn't have to be that way. But people are relating on it. It's almost like, oh, I'm in my mid-20s. Of course I'm anxious. Like, what? Why is that the case? Why aren't more people saying, I'm in my mid-20s and I'm desiring to source more courage so that I don't have fear that's leading my day-to-day? It's like, why are we finding... I think sense of community and safety is good for being able to understand one another, but we shouldn't be validating and enabling dysfunctional behavior that isn't even making us feel good, nor is it making the people around us feel any better.
Yeah. And it's weird because it's so tricky to even talk about this, because there's a genuine problem that people are experiencing,
100%.
obviously, and we want to acknowledge the problem, but there's this very thin line between acknowledgement and validating.
Yes.
There's almost this weird celebration of like, yeah, you have anxiety, me too. Like we all have anxiety. That's who we are.
Exactly.
And I think honestly, it's because people are so eager to find somewhere to their self-worth and identification from, that they'll pick anything. It doesn't even have to be a positive attribute.
I agree.
They can even pick a negative attribute. I'm curious if you think that therapy is actually harmful to a degree in this sense.
So I love therapy. I want to lead with that.
Yeah.
But there's a part of me that's jaded because I was in therapy for 10 years and no one told me that what I was experiencing, and this was multiple therapists, no one told me that what I was experiencing was anxiety or depression. And in some ways I appreciated the lack of label, because who knows, maybe my younger self would have identified with that. But there was no point at which it was called out like, hey, this part of you is in this negative thought cycle that you've been in for months. Do you want to rewrite that? Like, I would have loved more guidance on not just processing what had happened that week, but moving forward in the new identity that I wanted to adopt, a version of me that was confident, a version of me that was secure. So I really think it depends on the therapist, which also depends on where you're located. Like we're in the United States. It depends on state, location, accessibility. Right now, there's, I'm pretty sure, like a law that if you can work with like a psychological coach, no matter what state, but if you I live in Denver, Colorado. If I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm looking to go through my healthcare to source a psychologist or a therapist, I have to find someone in my state. So you are limited. And I think at some point, therapy should be supplemented with something like coaching, something that's goal-oriented and holding someone accountable to the discipline of stepping into a new identity. And that doesn't mean being inauthentic, but just implementing new habits and focusing forward. Because yes, we need to reflect and process trauma, and we can't overcome trauma through only focusing on healing. We also have to fall in love with the identity that we're stepping into and rewriting patterns with better ones in our mind, in our belief system, in our behavior. So I think with the right therapist, it's amazing. And it's helpful for putting how you're feeling into words. It's even more helpful if they offer context as to what's happening psychologically and teaching you as you are going to therapy. But I don't think that therapy is the only answer. I know many people who are in therapy and struggling still.
Yeah.
And they've been in therapy for months and they're not feeling any true change in their emotional state. So I think it depends on case by case too, and like where somebody's at.
Yeah. So I'll agree with you and bring it even a level deeper. I think that some people are actively in a loop that's encouraged by therapy. Like I think some people, they have a list that just keeps on getting longer of all the things that are wrong with them and all the stories for why there's something wrong. My mom did this. My dad did this. It's because of this thing that was said to me. And you can keep finding more fucking problems. And part of the problem is this is not a slight on therapists as individuals. I think it's a slight on the institution of therapy. A lot of the time, it's not structured to actually have someone heal. It's structured to have someone keep coming back. Like if you even think of the incentive model for a therapist, it's like if you're getting paid hourly, well, are you really incentivized to have someone solve a problem and then just leave and not come back? And I still go to therapy. I focus more on somatic therapy because I find that it feels much more decisive and progressive than I think maybe CBT sometimes, which can feel like it's just kind of looping on itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's fair to say it's beneficial and harmful past a point. And there are some therapists who I think are really skilled and act more like coaches and help people progress into a new identity. Yeah. But there's certainly ones that frankly are depressed themselves. Are just regurgitating what they've learned and actually aren't practitioners getting practical results. And I think that's why what you're doing is very important, right? Because there's people who will go to you and they'll get an identity shift that they were needing to something positive as opposed to just focusing on the negative.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious how you respond to this quote. So our Lord and Savior, Elon Musk, said, put never been to therapy on my tombstone, which was actually shocking. I was like, wow, he's never been to therapy. And I mean, depending on what side of a coin you fall on with Elon, there's like different personal, observations you can make. It's like, oh, maybe maybe you'd be a little bit more nice or compassionate, some people might say. But another way of looking at it is he's one of the most successful people in the world, objectively, and he doesn't go to therapy. Another person had a similar quote, Alex Hormozy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Yes, I am.
For those of us who are not familiar, he's basically high-level entrepreneur, nine-figure at this point entrepreneur who teaches people sales and just very deeply philosophical guy. He said, you don't need a therapist. You need to stop describing normal life as a problem. There's a sense in which, on one hand, we see that we have a mental health crisis, but we also see people who seem pretty mentally healthy and certainly very successful saying, hey, we actually don't need therapy as much as people think. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah. I think their success level has to be considered when thinking about their quotes. I do have the question of like, how empathetic are they embodying empathy? And if someone's going to identify with that belief, do they want to do business the same way as them, which I'm actually indifferent on. I'm more familiar with actually Alex Hormozy than Elon, which is funny because Elon is more known. But I agree that our scale as a society for what is hard and what's a problem and what's easeful, it's almost like we're associating things that are mildly challenging or push us out of our comfort zone as so hard. And I don't know if it's like a protective mechanism that people are almost preparing themselves, like, just in case I fail at this, like, oh, this is just so hard. It's easier to think of that. And I do think that it depends on somebody's intention for therapy. Are they going in to gain more self-control, to get better at leading themselves, to get better at understanding the truth of who they are versus their story, to become a better wife, husband, sister, brother, like human in the world and how they relate? Is that their intention? Or are they going to therapy so someone will finally just listen to them and tell them how right they are, and so that they can say, I go to therapy. I'm trying. I'm doing the work. I go to therapy every week. I go and I talk about my stuff, but there's no connection to their embodiment. I think that matters more than going to therapy or not. Is like, what is the intention of going to therapy or not?
So if I could, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And if I could interpret from what I'm hearing you saying, just correct me if I'm wrong. So it almost sounds like they're speaking to one category of people who go to therapy. And that category of people is people who just go to talk about their problems, but not necessarily with the intention of progressing and advancing.
Yes.
People who are going to just check off the box and say, yeah, well, it is hard. And now that I've said it to my therapist and they've reflected and said, how do you feel? I'm validated in this assumption that it's hard. As opposed to, it sounds like what you think is a more progressive model of therapy, which is going with an intention to become a new person.
Yeah.
Not to just rehash whatever issues you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
For sure. Yeah. And going to understand, why was this experience so hard for me, and what can I learn from that to make me stronger, versus going and being validated as to how that was so hard and feeling like, oh yeah, like that was really, really hard, and poor me for having to go through that. I just have a different relationship with hard things that have happened to me in my life. Like, I don't want to identify with someone that something happened to me and that moment defines me for the rest of my life, something that I wasn't even in control of, but I control how I relate to that thing. I'm going to choose a positive relation all day, every day, even if it was the most unfair circumstance, because that's what serves me to actually move forward. So I think intention is everything. And what I know about Alex and Elon is that they're both very action oriented. And there is a correlation there of like depression and people who are stuck in a depressive loop and the action that they take and the discipline that they have, versus people who are not depressed and take massive action and are very disciplined. I've sensed a correlation. I don't know the stats, but as someone who was there, I was doing significantly less than what I'm doing now. I was not as focused on my health. I barely moved my body. I barely could get out of bed. There was also, when I was depressed, but there was also no accountability from self of like, regardless of how I feel, I'm going to get up and get outside today. I didn't have that.
Yeah. And, I remember when I originally was depressed and first got diagnosed, identity issues aside, like, I think it's useful to have a problem to be defined as like, okay, depression, I know what this is. I can solve this. There's ways around this. For sure. I remember when very soon after, I got really motivated, actually. And I decided, I don't want to be fucking depressed. So I'm going to get my ass to the gym. And was it hard? Yeah, I was fucking fat. I was super insecure. I didn't like how I looked. I thought people were staring at me at the gym. But I decided, well, this is the one thing that I feel like I can just make a decision and get up and do. And I'm not saying that going to the gym cured my depression. Like, that was a healing journey that took years for me. But ultimately, me taking some steps to get control of my health, get some sort of discipline and some sort of rigor and some structure in my life helped me a hell of a lot. And I think oftentimes, to your point, like, it's very easy to just talk about the problem rather than find solutions to the problem as well. And it's hard to imagine someone taking as much action as Alex Hormozi or Elon does and being like, I mean, certainly less depressed, at least. Like, just
a little bit less.
Yeah, just a little bit. Right? I was like, I don't know what their true mental state is, and no one ever really knows.
That's another thing,
Yeah, but they don't strike me as depressed people. They strike me as certainly productive people. And you might as well be productive and depressed rather than unproductive and depressed if you're going to be something. So I'm glad that you're saying this, because I think it's important for people to recognize that no matter what pattern you're experiencing or emotional dysfunction, there are still things you can do.
100%. Yeah. And it's like, am I going to align my actions with the story and the reasons why this is hard? Or am I going to, despite it being really hard, align my actions with the version of me that's courageous, that gets to the gym even when I'm feeling insecure, or finds another aligned modality like yoga or Pilates or a HIIT class or F45, like something, even just a walk around your neighborhood, or if you don't want to be seen by anyone, driving somewhere where you know you won't be seen. I'm curious for you, when you made that decision, like, I'm going to get to the gym, even though I'm not going to say you were, I don't know. You're
fat.
I feel like I'm fat. I feel like these things, like those insecurities were real for you, and you were obviously like at a vulnerable time. What was how did you get yourself to the gym despite those feelings?
Yeah. I mean, first, I realized that part of what was causing my state was there just things within my control that I didn't like about myself, right? So I just didn't respect myself. Period. That's what it was. I realized not only was I depressed, like I could see I didn't have self-respect, and it was shown in how I ate. Like I was always eating like fast food and like Chinese food and staying up at awful hours of the night. And I realized like I don't like this about myself. And do I know like what shifted fundamentally? I don't, but I know what I thought about myself, which was this is not who I am, and I know who I want to be. So let me at least become that guy. And then, you know, if I have a six pack and I'm getting good sleep and you know, I'm a productive member of society and then I'm still depressed, then okay, we can address the deeper thing too.
For sure.
And not that it's like sequential, like you can do both at the same time, but I decided I want to do things that make me respect myself. That was it. And I think to your point about this, like kind of like this like victimhood that I think where we're kind of dancing around, but to name it, it's like, it's victimhood. It's like saying, oh, well, life is unfair, so I'm not going to do anything about it except talk about how unfair life is and identify with the fact like I'm a victim and you are too. And great, we're victims together. One thing you talked about was this idea of fairness though, like this idea of unfair things happening. So first, do you believe in fair, like there's such a thing as fairness?
I think that the universe has an incredible accounting system. And I do believe that everything happens for a reason. And I believe that people experience unfair circumstances at the will of other misaligned or unaligned humans.
Okay. Very sophisticated answer. I like that.
Yeah. I'd say that there is such a thing as like universal fairness and higher consciousness fairness and almost like a God source fairness, whatever you refer to that higher intelligence as, in that it always rights wrongs and vice versa. Or, you know, you make a wrong, that's met karma, essentially. What you put out, you will receive. But every human has free will, and hurt people. So I also believe that things can happen and it's unfair, but that doesn't change our responsibility of how we respond to that moment and what we make that moment mean for us in our life.
Okay, beautiful. So if we square this idea of, hey, there is such a thing as unfairness, like people go through unfair things. It sounds like you've gone through unfair things in your life that you identify with. What's an example of something that you can look at and you're like, yeah, that was unfair, even if you're over it, that you can identify in your own life?
Which one?
It's like looking through the day. That's like, with 99 or 143. I don't know which one to pick.
Do I go older, more recent? It's also hard when you rewrite so much story.
Sure.
Like, what was an unfair moment in my life? I'm so grateful for all of the moments, genuinely, at this point. Oh, I'll name one. A girl who used to bully me in like middle school, high school, for the way that I looked, knowing nothing about me, why I looked that way. She would just bully me when I was in school, and I cared about what she thought too. But that was unfair. I don't think little me deserved that.
Yeah. Okay. So now if you were to talk to that younger version of you who was going through something unfair, like you're getting bullied, that's fucking unfair. How do you speak to that person in a way that actually helps them progress rather than just validates what their experience is?
Are you talking about me in that moment?
Yeah, just as an example. So I think it's helpful for people to see like how you can acknowledge unfairness while also being progressive.
Yeah. Yeah, for that younger version of me, I'd ask like, what's going on and how is it making you feel? And almost offer a lens of empathy of like, what do you think that girl, the other girl, the bully, what do you think the bully experiences at home? If she's acting this way, what behavior do you think is modeled to her? Why do you think she'd want to say these things to you? Why do you think it would be on her heart to point these things out? Do you believe these things about you? Like, do you believe what she's saying to be true? Is there any truth to what she's saying? And are you in control of that? And is that something that you want to change about yourself because you're not liking that truth? Or is that truth something that you want to honor and just put yourself in a different environment of, like, can you create some distance from this girl? Because at the time I was in a group of people that hung around this girl. So I was actively choosing proximity to her in some ways, indirectly. So just empowering sovereignty. And there was some truth to what she was saying. Like my hair was a mess. I'm like, I looked messy, and helping that version of me understand the part of me that was judging myself, or that younger G, like, what part of you is judging yourself through what she's saying? And is it actually her words that are hurting you just as they are? Or is it something that is triggering, like, what part of you is letting that in? What part of you is allowing her opinion to have influence over you? What part of her is identifying with the truth of what she's saying? And can you do anything to actively change that thing so that you love that about yourself? Or create a block with her energy so that way you're not taking on what she thinks and you're doubling down on what you think about yourself.
Okay, beautiful. So just to devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
You kind of said with a laugh, like, your hair was messy.
Yeah.
Like, it's the bully, they were being mean, but there's also something truthful about what they were saying. I think a lot of the time when people hear that, it's like, well, that's just going to hurt the child even more, telling them that it's true what the bully said to a degree at least. So how would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Just because something's true doesn't mean it's kind to point it out. It's so funny. Like, I had like yellow teeth in middle school. Like, I was not taking care of my health, but there were good reasons for that. And my home life may have looked different than other kids' home lives. So while it is true, there is also harm in pointing things out from a place of judgment without understanding why that's the case. Like, why was I in that state of, why was I in that physical state, you know? And I can look back and say, like, yeah, there's truth to what she was saying. So I had to take responsibility of the change and understanding that some people are just going to be brutally honest. And there were things that she said that weren't true. But also, can we empower empathy and compassion in the middle school and high school age, so that bullies aren't fueled by, like, I'm just pointing out the truth? Because also, when someone desires to point out the truth from a place of judgment, it's typically because they're judging themselves to some degree too. So that person's hurting as well, even if they're like a perpetrator of hurt, they're also receiving hurt some way or have in the past. So it all comes back around to healing.
Yeah, I love this. This is a really good distinction that you're drawing, because sometimes the truth is not enough. It's how the truth is delivered and when the truth is delivered. So always truth, but with empathy is what I'm hearing you say.
With compassion and love.
Yeah. And going back to the Elon and Hormozy quote, it's like maybe that was lacking a bit of empathy.
For sure.
Right? Because the point here isn't that therapy is harmful or unnecessary. It's just, I think the deeper point that they could have probably made more lovingly is that you don't need certain things, you don't need to pathologize and take to therapy. Certain things just require different actions from you that 100%. You can take right now.
100%. Yeah, we can't say the truth is hurtful, because that's just not true. And like, I think a lot of people desire to avoid truth because it is painful for them to own, because it leads back to what you were saying with when you were depressed, having actions that you didn't like. Like, you didn't like those things about yourself. And I think that's one of the toughest parts about being in a place where you're depressed or you're in a low, is actually the way through isn't being told that you're amazing. It's addressing, where am I not amazing? Where do I not like myself? Because that's so much of the root of depression, is being out of alignment with our heart, who we truly are, and not having self-respect, not taking care of ourselves.
This idea of self-respect, I like that you're keying in on this, because here's the thing. Self-respect comes from doing things that show you respect yourself.
Yes.
That's it. It's not this amorphous, like, I don't have self-respect. No, you're not doing things that practice respecting yourself. It's the same thing with self-love. Like, I think a lot of the time when people talk about self-love, it's like this like abstract thing, like, just love yourself. No, loving yourself means putting good food in your body, moving your body, getting sunlight, nourishing your mind, like giving enough of a fuck about yourself to show yourself that you love yourself. And I think when we break it down in those terms, it's actually quite accessible to anyone. Like, you can love yourself by doing this thing. This thing is loving yourself, not this idea of loving yourself. So we've been talking a lot about like therapy, its benefits, its shortcomings, and we're both coaches. And it's interesting because we were having this discussion before the podcast about knowledge versus wisdom. And you're someone who was like, you know, if I were to have you as a therapist back in the day, I think I would have gotten better results than I did with the actual therapist I had. And it's not because you used to have some knowledge of technical training, but you're just speaking simple wisdom. And you're speaking with courage about like, hey, yeah, some of these things are true. Some of these things are not amazing about you. What do you want to change? And no therapist I ever had really challenged me. So how do you first distinguish between wisdom and knowledge? Because I think one is more present in the culture than other.
Yeah. Knowledge is information and facts, memorization, and having like read something or received a specific training, and it being like a mental process. Knowledge also comes from experience, but I think that more so leads into wisdom. Whereas wisdom, I think, is like lived knowledge. It's applied knowledge and knowing the nuance to knowledge and not looking at things as black and white and logical and just yes or no. It's like actually being able to read the gray area and apply to different circumstances, scenarios, personal needs. And it's more lived experience versus memorized facts.
That makes sense. So basically what I'm hearing is knowledge can just be told to you, right? It's more information and it's assimilated mentally, but wisdom comes from actually direct experience. And that goes back to the word you used earlier, which is embodiment.
Yeah.
Like you actually have to go through the thing and feel it and experience it fully to have real wisdom.
Yeah, either experience it fully or be able to understand somebody else's experience on an embodied level. Like really being able to truly empathize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a bit of a it's a bit of a mind fuck being a coach, honestly, sometimes. Because I feel like there are moments where I know my wisdom. Like I know my experiences. I just know what I know. I know the path that I've walked. But every once in a while I'll get a question like, oh, what makes you different than a therapist? Or why shouldn't I go to a therapist instead? So I'm curious for you, how do you reconcile this societal belief that, oh, you need information, more information, go to the person with the right information, with the right letters behind their name, versus what you do in your own practice, which I know is incredibly powerful and comes from wisdom. Obviously, you have some knowledge backing what you're doing, but it very much comes from you being bullied in school and having to rewrite your narratives around that, or you having suicidal ideation when you're 11 and having to actually go through the experience of changing that, or you being on these antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications and it fucking you up even more, and then doing the work to move to a place of joy. So how do you distinguish the difference between a wisdom practitioner versus a knowledge provider?
Yeah. For me personally, this isn't a good answer. It's not like the replicable answer, but I really go based on vibe. Like I can tell who's living it and who's not. So if I were personally looking for someone who could support me, like who is the embodiment of who I'm moving towards, and are they living the lifestyle that I want to live in every area? There's some people, like if someone has an experience therapy and they're really feeling a call and they experience anxiety or depression in their life, I often suggest therapy just for the experience of going and again being able to digest the feelings in your body into language and into words. I think that hones our empathy. So I believe that therapy is incredibly powerful for that reason. But yeah, one of the qualifiers I'd encourage someone to look at is, do you know the life that this person is living behind closed doors? Are they living a life that you want to live in every area? Do they have a healthy marriage? Are they making a healthy living for themselves? And are they great at what they do? Not just because they're experienced and knowledgeable, but because they have nuance and are able to meet you where you're at and cater to your individual needs if you're going them for such vulnerable support. That's what I would encourage someone to find.
Yeah. It's funny how it's almost uncomfortable to even say that. Like, hey, actually pay attention to who the person is, not the degrees that they have or the knowledge that they have. Because that actually seems like the first thing that you should be looking at. Is the person who I'm allowing to influence me a person who I want to be like?
Yeah.
But it feels like in modern society, we're so disconnected from ourselves. People don't even trust themselves to have a good judgment about someone else. So they just want outsourced authority, like more letters and degrees and certifications and, bullshit status indicators. Not bullshit, but like shallow indicators of someone's actual competency and actual wisdom. And I think that increasingly, I don't know how you feel, but I feel like I'm part of a wave that's about like, hey, are you actually the person? Are you actually the person that I want to be like and be around? And that should be count for a lot more than information and credentialing, frankly, especially with, this is a whole different topic that we'll get into this, education.
Yeah.
Like, I think people largely agree that our educational system seems pretty fucked. It doesn't seem like it's actually preparing people effectively for life. Yeah. But we still hold the stock in like degrees. So first, I'm curious, what do you think our educational system should actually be doing?
You hit on something so important, which is that people don't trust their own judgment, actually. Like, people are so disconnected from self that they question decisions that they're making, and they would rather, instead of honing that judgment and aligning their free will with, again, the reality that they want to move towards and taking responsibility there, they just outsource it to authority. And I think that that's what our education system teaches people to do in some ways. It's just listen, memorize, crush the quiz or exam. And then that's it. At least I'm thinking, elementary, middle, grammar school. But what about acknowledging that we are humans with free will, and we should probably hone our moral and belief system and calibrate it before we turn 18, if we can, so that we know we're choosing the direction that we want to head in our life. We know how to do that. And that, like, why isn't our many reasons why our education system isn't teaching that, but that's one of the key things that I think is missing, is just how to be a human. So many people graduate from high school and they're like, I don't even know how to, get my, write a check or learn how to invest. And I think actually empowering people to live an abundant life that they have sovereignty in, and actually help them hone their free will so that they can apply it towards a life that they want, versus just hoping that answers will come, trusting the next degree to reveal their vision to them and their, to heal their money wounds. So many people are searching degree after degree to finally feel good enough at what they do to go out, and then they go back to school because they're still not feeling good enough. Where's that support in being human and being sensitive to the human experience? I didn't experience any of that in school.
I agree. And I went to Harvard.
For real.
I honestly can't. I wasn't a great student, just to be clear. And I'm not going to be like, I was depressed. I mean, I was, but I just wasn't a great student. I didn't really care about being at Harvard. Honestly, probably shouldn't have even gone. I went there to get a gold star and to look cool and to have validation from my community and my parents. But in hindsight, I wish what I had gotten instead of knowledge was self-knowledge. I think that's what we need to actually be teaching people, not to know a bunch of multiplication tables and historical dates and facts, but to have self-knowledge first so that they can learn how to make decisions for themselves in their actual life.
Yes.
And unfortunately, people graduate with a bunch of degrees, but they don't graduate with any knowledge of self. And of course, just like you're saying, they'll just go back and keep getting more degrees and more degrees and keep spending more and more money. And frankly, like, I know some people who they're in a trap of continually just getting more masters and PhDs, and not because they genuinely enjoy the pursuit of the knowledge and add it to the store of human wisdom and information, but because they're scared.
Right.
and they don't know what they need to do. They don't know what they want to do. And it would be one thing if you just wasted time by doing that, but you don't just waste time, you waste hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So true.
So this would be fun, actually. If you were to pick like 3 subjects that you start a kid learning, like let's say like kindergarten, like what are the first things that they need to learn besides like the basic stuff like how to read and write? How would you revise a curriculum?
First is, I think actually kids would benefit from knowing how to make healthy choices for your body, like how to learn your, and this is so simple to teach a kid, learning your body's yes and no. Like, yes, your mind wants the candy, but what does your body really desire? Do you want this fruit? Like, kids have endless energy, but like which one is going to help you feel more energized? Teaching them the differences between sugar highs and like actual sustainable nourishment for their body. That's something that I wish I learned when I was younger, is actually what is a balanced meal. And maybe this is a little bit later when they're 8, 9, 10, teenagers, but our gut influences our mind. So helping people understand, or helping kids understand, that what they put in their body makes a difference for how they experience life. And then the other is play. I think that having organized play, like yes, recess, but also having play that encourages kids to get out of their comfort zone in a playful way, but really honors and protects their innocence. Some kids like don't get that at home, especially. And so having that in like an organized institution like school, I think is really beneficial. And entry-level psychology, just understanding feelings and emotions, and that they're things that pass through us. They're not things that are us. They're attached to our thoughts. And different people have different emotions, and that's okay. Like just baseline understanding of self so that we can also have baseline understanding of others. And I think that would help with social dynamics too, as well as confidence in the kid. I think kids are way smarter than we give them credit for, and they get capped because of ignorant adults around them who don't know their emotional spectrum, so they can't help teach the child. And if we could teach kids empathy, understanding like from the psychological sense, I think they'd pick it up really quickly, and their world would make a lot more sense to them.
Wow. As you said, like entry psychology, and it's like, hey, yeah, you're not your thoughts, and your thoughts contribute to your emotions. And if you want to feel different, you should think different. I'm realizing I didn't know that stuff until I was like 29. Mm-hmm. Like imagine a world where everyone knew that coming out of kindergarten, first, like, think this thought, how does that feel? Eat this food, how does that feel? Like we have the wisdom, and we're taught everything but to check in with ourselves, unfortunately. And it seems silly that we're even talking about this, but that would be a radically different world already. Yeah. So speaking of just like education and like what we teach people, what do you think adults need to learn in order to find purpose and like really find their path? Because right now I feel like a lot of the mental health crisis is actually due to a crisis of meaning and purpose, and understanding what to do with one's life. So what is the sort of like, if we think of entry-level psychology and all these foundational things is what kids need to learn, what do adults need to learn so that they actually go on to live a purposeful, productive life?
Okay, I have a lot more thoughts for this one. I'm like, what can kids handle? But adults can handle so much. And I think we need like a choose your adventure class or curriculum where, 16, 17, 18-year-olds are told like, as you choose your adventure for college, and as you like, here's how to make aligned choices with the direction in life that you want to head in. When I graduated from high school and I went to college, I was like, I'm going to be a speech pathologist. I'm on the path, not realizing that the grades that I was getting, like, I actually wasn't on that path. I thought I was, and then I really wasn't doing what I needed to do to prepare myself. And in some ways, it just like a greater path revealed itself. And I trusted that, and I let it, or I followed it. And I'm so grateful that I did. But I think really learning how to choose the adventure of your own life and helping people realize like not just the don't do drugs. Like the choices of drugs or not drugs change your life, but also the choices of thought, who you choose to be, how you choose to interact with people, and how you choose to engage and make friends. Like all of that influences your life too. And almost like a holistic life class of, what is your vision for your relationship that you want to be in, the kind of marriage that you want, the house that you want to have when you're older, where do you want to live, etc. I also think that we need more financial literacy because that's a huge gap for people. People just don't know what it takes to live the lifestyle that they want to live financially, and investing, understanding that. I took a contemporary moral issues class in college, and this is actually one of the greatest classes I ever took. And we talked about polarizing topics, and it was like euthanasia, abortion, like the most taboo things. And the class had to pick a side, pro or against. And we would defend our side and have to like listen to the other side as well. And I think classes or curriculums that hone our learning of one another and having open conversations and being curious, similar to this podcast, like teaching people that if someone has a different opinion of you, they likely have good reason. If you would just ask and try to understand where they're coming from, and then they do the same for you, and then you find where the middle ground is, even if you have totally polarizing differing opinions, you may be really similar underneath those opinions if you would just look for it. So those are a couple. And then I would love for there to be classes on spirituality and alignment as well, because that is part of our reality, whether people are willing to acknowledge it or not. And acknowledging it just makes life better.
Tell me what you mean by spirituality.
That everything is energy, even weaving in quantum physics to it. Like everything is energy and thoughts hold vibration. And there is a sense of oneness that runs through us all, where no matter how different, I mean, I can even relate to like the serial killers of the world. I have empathy for. Do I think their behaviors are batshit crazy? Yeah. Would I ever condone their behavior? No. Would I ever justify it? Absolutely not. But so many of them are abused as children. Most of them, if not all. I've actually never heard of a serial killer that was just born that way. They always have rough childhoods. So it's like, I can understand that might fracture a soul at a young age and create chaos in the mind that bleeds into the personality. And underneath it all, feel that similarity and energy between me and that person. So, teaching love and what it means to be human, like on an energetic level, how in control we really are of our life, and how to interact with reality.
This is an interesting definition of spirituality because I went to Catholic school and I was raised with, I guess, a very particular version of spirituality, which is there's a God. He has these 10 commandments. It's a he. He's going to punish you if you don't follow him, and you're going to go to hell. And that had a huge impact on my psyche. I didn't realize until very recently how much the fear of going to hell actually impacted my psyche.
Yep.
But what you're talking about is more of an understanding of what we are beyond the physical.
Yes.
Is that a fair definition of spirituality to you? Yeah. So playing with this little thought experiment of like how we would teach people spirituality in a way that feels like practical and something that we could actually like ground. How would you approach it? Because I think a lot of time when people hear like, we're all energy, it's like, oh, here we go, hippie shit again. It's like, I don't know what that means. But I understand what you mean. But imagine you're talking to a past version of me who is like maybe completely atheistic, can't actually feel themselves. Like even the idea of energy, there's no embodied connection to that concept. How would you talk to that person about the spirituality? So your Professor Nappi is seventh grade class. Tell me how you would educate someone on spirituality.
What's tricky is that I really believe in everyone having an authentic relationship with their faith in whatever context that means for them. But what I would do is probably lead lectures talking about like near-death experiences. And so this was a huge source of my spiritual awakening, was with NDEs, understanding people come from all walks of life, all different backgrounds, different parts of the world. And yet when they have a near-death experience, many of them describe the same exact things, that there is an overwhelming sense of love and being at home and safety that is beyond language, that you enter a tunnel of light, that at some point you are surrounded by loved ones that you both recognize as people who have been in your life and people who are in your lineage and that you don't recognize but are meaningful to you. You're shown a past life review, which is having to live every moment of your life from birth until death, and not just your own experience, but how your actions impacted and influenced others' emotions, both positive and negative. So I would start with near-death experiences, and diving into this life review, start discussions about, like, do you believe that this could be true? Because I think free will is one of the greatest gifts that we have, sovereignty and choosing our beliefs. And if this is true, let's just play with it. Like, what experience do you want to have in your past life review? Like, do you want to be someone that makes people feel really good? Or do you want to be someone that has to live through the suffering that you caused people when you bullied them, when you hit your brother or sister, when you said, I hate you to your mom? Like, you feel that. Yeah. So just something that empowers people to choose goodness in how they treat others and how they treat themselves, and just being more mindful of their experience, whether or not they believe in a God or something. Like, it leads to a more present life to choose good actions and service, even if there's nothing beyond it. We shouldn't be doing good things just to get into heaven. That's a transactional relationship with goodness. We should be good people so that we create good experiences for others and experience more joy and fulfillment ourselves.
That's a bar. Thank you. This is a really accessible idea of spirituality. It's almost like Stoicism. So in Stoicism, there's this saying, memento mori, remember that you will die. And the reason that they talk about memento mori is not to scare you, but to make you present to the fact that, hey, you will die. And when you realize that you'll die, it makes your life much more meaningful too. So this idea of a curriculum where you actually start with near-death experience to teach people about life is actually quite brilliant, because then it's not actually about deities or any of these more abstract ideas. It's about a common truth. You're going to die. So what do you want your life to look like? And if you live with that awareness of death, then you're going to choose a different kind of life than if you think you're going to live forever, or you think that your actions don't actually really have consequences. So why do you think, as a society, we're so resistant to exploring the idea of death? Because I don't think death was ever mentioned in school growing up for me.
Imagine you just walk in on a Thursday to class and your teacher's like, death. We're talking about death today.
Let's talk about dying. Hilarious. But maybe that's what needs to happen.
Maybe it does. Yeah. I was trying to recall, and, I think death is so close to my heart because my grandfather lived with us until I was 7 years old. And I saw him really regress health-wise. Like, he went from being able to pick me up when I was a toddler and play with me and walk around the house to being bedridden. And he had epilepsy. And so I experienced multiple ambulances being called to our house and him being rushed out. And I had such a strong bond with him. I would go and watch Law and Order with him while he was hanging out in his hospital bed. And I just wanted to be around him. And I felt this closeness. And then when he passed, death became a really curious concept to me. And then I started getting visits from him in my dreams, but he was never physically him. He would show up in sparkles. And it was almost like I had this concept of energy because I was raised Catholic. So I had a belief that ghosts were these white figures that are translucent and walk around. And yet my mind was in my dreams forming energetic beings. So for me, I was always naturally a little bit tapped in, but death became a really curious concept. And it was what happens after we die? Do we live on? Do we get reincarnated? And what do we want our life to mean? There's this poem actually called Live Your Dash, and I have it in one of my one of my tattoos here. And it's like when you pass away, on your tombstone is your birthday and then the day you died. And then the dash represents everything in between. And so the concept is to live your dash and make that dash as meaningful as possible. It's a really beautiful poem. And the truth is, we don't know when we're going to die. We actually have no control over that. So are we living each day, creating the legacy that we want to leave? And also, will we be remembered when we die? Like, is your life worth talking about and living on? Is your spirit one that's going to like live through other people? And is that important to you? I think it's a really fun concept to play with, despite its morbidity.
Yeah, live your dash.
Yeah.
And I think this fear of death, or maybe this neuroticism around death, is not a global thing. I think it's a pretty uniquely Western thing. Because if you look at
so true.
Mexican culture, Dia de los Muertos, they literally have a Day of the Dead. And it's, as I understand it, at least, it's a celebratory day. Obviously, there's a healthy desire to not die.
Yeah.
But I think this neurosis and avoidance of ever talking about death and how we treat people who are dying in Western society, like we sequester them, we put them away. It's not healthy and it's not normal, actually. So I think when we talk about, it'll be weird to go into a fourth grade classroom and talk about death, maybe it's only weird to us.
So true.
Maybe it's not actually inherently weird. And I think kids will become acquainted with the idea of death at some point. So why not just intentionally help them become acquainted with it too?
Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about a different topic here, and that's about relationships and love, which I know you coach people on and you're an expert on. And you have a really beautiful relationship with Alex, and you're great. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is masculine feminine dynamics, but the shadow side. So toxic femininity is something I've been playing with. Like, is there such a thing as toxic femininity? Because we talk about toxic masculinity all the time. And obviously there's a light side of like empowered, healed masculinity, empowered and healed femininity. So if you would humor me, I would actually be curious to come up with a full paradigm of masculine and feminine, starting with like the toxic versions of both. So what's toxic femininity?
First thing that comes to mind is the hyperachieving woman who shames her man, who says, like, are you going to eat that? Like, you're going to choose to do that? Okay. Like, you didn't get me a coffee today. Like, the shame and highlighting of the behavior that they don't want. Almost as like a defense mechanism is really common. Doing things to your man that you'd never want done to you. So saying, oh, that guy's so hot. Like, imagine I got with him, or like saying things that I've seen so many women do this, like say things that if their guy said, they would make the biggest deal over. So I think there's an essence of toxic femininity rooted in double standards. And this might just be like a dysfunctional relationship dynamic that I see in women predominantly. I don't know if it's necessarily like toxic femininity. But that's something that comes to mind. I'm curious to know what you consider to be toxic femininity versus toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
I agree with this part of the definition with the shaming. I would include blaming, actually. I think the shadow side of feminine consciousness is like, so I think feminine energy is vulnerable. It's inherently a vulnerable, open energy. But I think the shadow side of that is victimhood and blaming.
Yeah.
And making someone else the problem and someone else the perpetrator. And usually it's through shame. And I think that we're experiencing a lot of that in the culture. So I would say shaming, blaming, and victimhood with the manipulation that you pointed out as well.
Yeah.
And it's really weird because to talk about toxic masculinity, I think everyone's more well acquainted with what that looks like. It's control, it's tyranny, it's physical oppression, it's being a perpetrator. Like it's a real thing. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, I think toxic femininity is actually much more subtle because it's much more emotional oppression and emotional manipulation as opposed to physical manipulation. And that, as a result, it's much harder to identify when it's going on, and it's much more sensitive to call out because they play off one another.
Yes.
Like, I think what's happened is over like millennia, women have absolutely been oppressed. There's absolutely been a toxic masculine consciousness that's physically oppressed women. And then ironically, I think what we call feminism, the feminist movement, I think it's actually women stepping more into their masculine power, women gaining more independence by the ability to provide resources for themselves and like physically detach themselves from men. Because if a woman knows she can make her own money, then she does not to subject herself to a man's bullshit. So I think it's actually women coming more into their masculine. And to your point about the example that you gave, like a hyperachieving woman who shames her man, that's actually a masculine woman with a toxic feminine consciousness.
Yes.
That's actually what's going on there.
Yeah, it is.
And they play off of one another, and they're both prevalent. They're like, you don't have a toxic version of one without the toxic version of the other playing out in some way. So that's what I think toxic femininity is. I think it's shaming, it's blaming, and it's excessive victimhood. And not from a place of accountability, but from a place of trying to it's retaliatory. Yeah, is what it looks like.
Yeah, and there's like this attachment to rightness. Like, I must be right, and and finding power in being correct, which is opposing your partner. Yeah. But I agree with all of that.
Cool. So we have a working definition of toxic femininity. Yes. Now give me your definition of toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity. There's an element of it where the man doesn't acknowledge the woman as an equal. Like, there is the man is better or more valuable, like holds more value than the woman. A value of action over empathy and safety, like psychological safety and companionship, and it just being resource based, and there's a lack of ownership around like the relating and relating in a healthy way or in a safe way. A man who does not, and this is really bouncing off of what you already said, because I agree with all of that in regards to toxic masculinity, like the control, the oppression, but in both elements of the toxicity, femininity and masculinity, there's also a sense of separation where they're opposing, and I mentioned this, like they're opposing their partner. And I think toxic masculinity is when the man doesn't own the sensitivity of the woman's emotions and her well-being in the same regard as his own. Like, he prioritizes his over hers in the relationship, if hers at all, if there's any space for hers at all.
Got it. Okay, wonderful. So what I'm hearing is it's actually comes from not valuing a woman's contributions, or a byproduct of toxic masculinity is not valuing a woman's contributions. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because I think of the man I used to be, who was a good man, but very insensitive. Like, literally, I couldn't sense my own emotions. So it'd be harder to value a woman's contributions because I literally could not perceive them. Whereas money, very easy to value. Yeah. Protecting and providing, very obvious, right? Because that's very physical. It's not in the emotional realm. Totally. And I think that's why historically a lot of men have just been ignorant to a woman's contributions and would put her on a lower position, because it's like, I don't see what you do, but the woman sees what she does, right? And then as a man, as you heal yourself, you're like, oh, I see exactly what she's doing, and it's so fucking valuable. Yeah.
What's really interesting too about that man who doesn't honor the woman's contribution, they also, oftentimes you'll see the woman go into a caretaking mode in that relationship where she's doing a lot for him. And this happens in a lot of dynamics where people are like living together, like doing the dishes, doing so many of the little things are overlooked and then also taken for granted because it's just happening in service of the man. And that's how he views it, versus it being in service of the home and environment for the family. It's all about him.
Okay. Interesting. So they compensate for this not being valued by doing more physical things to take care of him. Is that how you describe it?
I think sometimes women do that. And also, those are some of the things that can go overlooked by that man who's only valuing the resources, like the money, the providership. Like, if he bought the house, is taking the little like nurturing things for granted, like doing the dishes, doing the laundry, making him lunch or dinner. It's like almost like those things are expected because he's the man, which becomes toxic when they become taken for granted. Those things aren't a toxic dynamic, but the expectancy around them can make them toxic.
Got it.
Like the taking it for granted versus a very simple shift is just the man appreciating all of those little things that his woman is doing for him to empower him. And just that appreciation making the dynamic healthy.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about that appreciation, because I think it actually touches on what does healthy masculinity look like and what does healthy femininity look like. So if we could define this relationally, what does healthy masculinity look like to you?
Healthy masculinity is leadership that takes into account the man's wants as well as the woman's wants and their best interests together, like as a collective unit, but also honoring their individuality. Being attuned to her needs, and implied in that is the woman communicating her needs and wants versus expecting the man to read her mind. So honoring and not just doing things to meet her expectations and because she's expressed it as a need or want in the relationship, but actually because it feels good for him to do those things for her and be a partner that is worthy of that woman. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
There's like a nuance of energy there. I believe it's also leading financially. And there are dynamics where it's okay if the woman is the breadwinner. I don't think that makes it a bad thing, but the man taking the lead on finances and contributing, and doing his best and being growth oriented and being a hunter, like for his family, and for his woman, and just being almost taking on the responsibility of resource gathering. Even if she's contributing to it, there should still be an element of like gathering and protecting of resources that the man adopts. Getting the door for her, bringing her coffee in the morning, like doing little sweet acts that empower her ability to nurture as well. Oftentimes, women who are very nurturing become the nurturer so often that the man doesn't think to do those little things for her. So it's doing the little things, taking her out to dinner, really taking care of her, including in the bedroom. Women should be getting off just as much as men are getting off. And that shouldn't be something that women have to ask for. That should be something that the man desires to give. It's the desire to give his woman pleasure, not just in the bedroom, but in all areas of life, and to be a partner that instills pleasure into her life, not just through resources, but again, that emotional safety. And being sensitive and attuned to her desires and her wants, even if she's not describing them. And then for the woman, it's trusting your man to lead, allowing him opportunities to step into leadership versus just doing it by default, or showing up at a certain level of leadership and then expecting him to overpower you to gain the leadership. No, just allowing space for him to take the lead. And if your needs aren't met, being able to communicate that. And rather than blowing up saying hey, because sometimes men, no offense, just don't know. There is ignorance. And so saying hey, when you did this, it made me feel this way. I would really love if you would do this instead, or here's how I receive love. And there being honest communication about that. Actually, nothing else is on my heart for women. And then I think interpersonal dynamics is being able to create the safety to express your needs. And when something doesn't feel good, having the safety to express that too. Doing it respectfully, not making it about the other person, but really isolating the person's behavior, getting curious about the behavior, and then getting on the same page. One of the reasons that Alex and I don't argue is because we really value what the other person thinks, and there's safety in our relationship for when someone's needs aren't being met, we can express that and the other person isn't going to get defensive. We actually care. We value this person's insight. We live together. We know each other best. So if someone's saying, hey, you're a little bit moody today. Am I moody? Yeah, I am. I don't know why I'm feeling moody, or yeah, I'm feeling it because of this way. Sorry that it came out towards you. Not intended at all. this subtle just moments of ownership build a lot of trust in a relationship too. And then I think for both sides, consistency of character creates a lot of safety and trust.
Cool. Beautiful. So let me just recap what you said about what healthy masculinity looks like in response to the feminine, and then what healthy femininity looks like in response to the masculine.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that healthy masculinity looks like leadership. Mm-hmm. It looks like provision of resources, money, and protection, and providing safety both physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
As well as being attuned to the needs of the feminine.
Yeah.
So, and obviously there's some space to allow for the feminine needs to communicate needs, but there's also a level of presence and sensitivity that the masculine needs to anticipate the needs.
Yes.
And be able to provide in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair recap of healthy masculinity?
Definitely.
Cool. Now, what healthy femininity looks like in response to the masculine, according to your definition, is allowing space to lead, trusting him to lead, giving him power, actually, to provide these things and to go be the hunter and to go take the lead. And I would actually add on to that. I think this goes both ways, but I'm just speaking from a man's perspective. What feels really good to receive from the feminine is appreciation.
Yes. Yes.
It goes so fucking far. I don't think many women understand how far it goes to have not just a thank you, a deep seeing. I see what you did. I see how you did it. I see how you were paying attention. I see the work that it took. Thank you. That, I think, is what the feminine could provide for the masculine. And unfortunately, what it feels like we have in modernity is the feminine and women. I'm using them kind of interchangeably, but we'll just keep a gender binary, just keep things simple. I think what I feel is women expressing the need, but not in an empowering way. So it can almost feel like, do this, otherwise you're bad. Do this to prove to me that you're not toxic. Do this, otherwise there's going to be shame attended here. And it's just not an effective strategy. Regardless of good and bad, it's just not, it doesn't motivate. And we're in this really weird cycle. If we look at this historically, it's okay, this toxic masculine perpetrator consciousness who's physically oppressing women, taking advantage of women, all this horrible shit. Then women understandably feel resentful. Then mothers pass that resentment on to their sons. Then sons become fearful of their own power and their own masculinity, and they're disconnected from themselves, and they become weak. They become, put it crudely, beta bitches. And from that place, they actually might hate their own dad because their dad might represent to them scary power. But what they're not seeing in their dad is, okay, but he's able to protect and provide. He's just not doing it in a very integrated way. And then women start to wonder, well, where are the men? Well, if you had resentment toward men understandably for doing fucked up things, and then you pass that on, then men are going to be afraid of themselves. And I think that's what's going on a lot of the time. I think a lot of men are really afraid of themselves, or they go the other direction. It's I don't give a fuck these bitches. I'm just going to be disconnected, and who cares anyway, which is not healthy either. So at both extreme, it's a huge problem because the thing is with these disempowered men, they're actually just a volcano waiting to blow, because that primal masculine part of them is still there. It's just unintegrated. He doesn't know what to do with it. And then he becomes this nice guy who eventually decides, I'm not getting what I want, and he explodes. So no one is being served by this. So what's the way out of this? Because it feels like gender dynamics are super, super confusing right now. And it feels like it feels unsafe to even talk about. Every time I talk about toxic femininity, I'm it seems obvious that we should be talking about that too, not to place blame, but to incorporate the gestalt of the issue, not just one part of it.
Yeah.
So how do you think we pattern interrupt this entire cycle that I described?
Oh my gosh. I agree with all of that. And the way you put it was so brilliant. I'm yes, I agree. And I think it goes back to earlier parts of the conversation where we have to align with the vision of what do we actually want our partnership and our relationship to look like, whether it's for now or forever. Who is the person that we want to be in relationship to create the relationship dynamic that we want? And what is it that we want? And then people need to embark in their own healing before getting into a relationship. I think this comes from getting into relationships and woundedness, rubbing up against woundedness, and ego being met with ego instead of being met with heart and love, which should be the root of relating, simply because people are limited by what's modeled to them. Like, it's so crazy. The statistic for women who get divorced because their parents are divorced is like 60 or 70%. It's insane. And I became obsessed with that statistic because in my earlier relationships, I had 3 serious relationships before dating Alex. And I can look back and in all 3 of those relationships see where I was acting from woundedness and I was not being a good person to date. Yeah. That I had to then own and say, okay, why is this coming up in me? Why is it that I want to defend and argue? Or why is it that I get insecure and controlling and manipulative? Why is that? Because I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't like what it brings out in the person that I'm dating, where they're lying and hiding things because they don't want to deal with my BS. So it's like, we have to become the person that we want to attract, and empowering people to actually go on that journey before relating. So that way we're not just like recreating these, like this generational trauma that's running through relationships that aren't working. Our parents didn't figure marriage out. Like, the divorce rate among the boomer generation is insane. So yeah, I think it starts with finding our own self-empowerment and healthy relating before actually getting into a relationship, or making that a focus. If you find a person that you really want to make it work with, that you have a lot of alignment with, growing individually together, getting into a container where you're in relationship therapy, or you're in a relationship coaching container where you're both working on yourselves individually. So that way there's understanding to the patterning that's living out unconsciously.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing is conscious vision of what you want your relationship to look like.
Yep.
And not just good, and not just not my parents, but like what does it look like? Like, what's my role in the ideal relationship? How do I relate to them? How do I deal with conflict? Like, conscious. And then the individual healing and recognizing like, hey, I need to take accountability for myself. Yep. And I will say, like, I am sympathetic to the plight of women, because I think women generally have much more emotional awareness and intelligence to recognize the value of healing. Like, I think women are much more likely to go on that journey than men.
I agree.
And, I have women friends who are like, well, where are all the healed men? Like, where are the men doing this work? And there's just less of them. There's fewer of them. Frankly, like, I didn't intend to get into the healing path. It just kind of got knocked around enough by life. I was like, I got to look at myself. And like, I got to fix this shit. So it's tough. And I could see how it's frustrating for women, because if you're a woman who's doing this work and you feel like there's fewer men doing this work, then it can be very easy to slip into resentment. But that doesn't get us anywhere.
Yeah.
That doesn't get us anywhere.
I think that's where the world needs more men like you speaking out and being a model of abundant resources and consciousness and healed, integrated embodiment. Because going back to Alex Hormozi and Elon Musk, they're amazing. And Alex, I know, has a great relationship with Layla. I don't know much about their relationship, but it would be even cooler if those men pointed to, and I don't think Elon's married to anybody, like these men who have success materially, also pointing to, the reason why I have success in my relationship is because I've done the inner work. Like, this isn't something that comes with the, third business that I sold. It's like, this actually came from the man that I was internally, not because of the resources that I have. And we have this relationship because of where I'm at. Just more men being a model for that. Because I think women have models, and it's just less talked about with men. And those men are saying, never gone to therapy in my life. They're almost implying the opposite. And they have resources that men admire. So men with resources being more of an advocate for doing that internal healing work and doing it in an environment with men. Because I think it's way different to go to an event like yours in Tulum. What was the name of that again? Lineage. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Going to Lineage where you're with men and it's primal and you're in your masculine while healing, versus going into a feminine container to be healed. Very different. So the world just needs more Kaizens.
Oh, thank you.
You're
Wow.
welcome.
I'm so flattered. So thank you for that recognition. And I agree. I think it's up to women to hold the standard for how they'd like to be treated. And I think it's up to men to support each other in meeting that standard. Like I think men actually need other men to create these environments to do that safely together. Totally. And on both sides, it just requires ownership and deciding, hey, like we need to look ahead, not behind. So Gina, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful interview. I'm so glad about the scope of things that we got to explore. I'm so glad the depth that you brought to every part of this discussion. And I'm excited for more and more people to get to experience the wisdom that you shared today. So where can people learn more about you if they want to work with you, if they want to experience you more, any of that?
Thank you for having me. Best place is Instagram at It's Gina Nappi, Nappi with an I. And I'm also on TikTok, but Instagram is where most of my communication is.
Awesome. And that's Nappi.
Yes.
Wonderful. Gina, thank you.
Thanks, Kaizen.
So that's it for this episode of Conversations with Kaizen with Gina. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I would love to hear what in particular you enjoyed the most, because we talked about education, we talked about the pros and cons of therapy, we talked about Elon Musk and Alex Hormozy, we talked about toxic femininity, toxic masculinity, all of it. So just let me know what you loved, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.